girl reports hearing children's laughter from his neighbor house. When the police investigate, what they find is shocking. The beginning of summer in Millbrook, Connecticut always brought with it a particular kind of silence. Sarah Mitchell noticed it most acutely on Tuesday afternoons, when she sat in her backyard with a book propped against her knees, waiting for her parents to return from work. The silence wasn't complete. There were still birds chattering in the maple trees, the distant hum of lawn mowers, and the occasional car passing down Maple Grove Avenue. But it lacked the usual soundtrack of children playing that had filled the neighborhood during the school year. At 11, Sarah was old enough to stay home alone after summer school let out at 2 p.m., but not quite old enough to go to the community pool by herself. Her mother, Claire, had written out a detailed schedule that hung on the refrigerator door. Arrive home by 2:30, homework until 4 o'clock, if any, reading or quiet activities until 5:30, when either mom or dad would be home. No cooking, no friends over, no answering the door. "You're my responsible girl," Claire had said, kissing the top of Sarah's head before rushing off to another early morning meeting at the insurance company. "I know you'll make good choices." Sarah took her responsibility seriously, even if it meant spending long afternoons alone with her books and her thoughts. Today she was attempting to read The Secret Garden for the third time, but the humid June air made it difficult to concentrate. She shifted on the wooden bench her father had built last summer, trying to find a comfortable position that wouldn't stick to her skin. That's when she heard it, children's laughter, bright and clear, floating over the tall privacy fence from Mrs. Walsh's yard next door. Sarah sat up straighter, marking her place in the book with her finger. In the 3 years they'd lived in this house, she'd never heard children at the Walsh place. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh lived alone in the imposing Victorian home, a widow who rarely emerged except to receive her weekly grocery delivery or to clip at her rose bushes in the early morning hours. Sarah's mother called her a character, in that particular tone adults used when they meant something else entirely. The laughter came again, this time accompanied by what sounded like a game of tag, running feet, breathless giggles, and a young voice calling out, "You can't catch me!" Sarah closed her book entirely and moved closer to the fence. There were definitely at least 2 children playing, maybe more. Standing on her tiptoes, Sarah could just see over the fence if she stretched. Mrs. Walsh's backyard was as immaculate as ever, with its perfectly trimmed lawn and carefully tended flower beds. But there was no one in sight. The curtains in the bay window were drawn, as they always were, though Sarah thought she saw one twitch slightly. "Hello?" she called out softly, then felt foolish. The laughter continued for a moment longer, then faded away like a radio being turned down gradually. That evening, over a dinner of delivered pizza, Dad was working late again. Sarah mentioned what she'd heard to her mother. "Mrs. Walsh must have visitors," she said, picking the mushrooms off her slice and arranging them in a neat line on her paper plate. "I heard kids playing in her yard today." Claire Mitchell looked up from her phone, where she'd been answering work emails between bites. "That's nice," she said absently. "It's good she's having family over. That house is too big for one person anyway." She frowned at something on her screen and began typing rapidly. "But I didn't see anyone," Sarah persisted. "I looked over the fence and the yard was empty." Her mother finally put the phone down, but only to give Sarah a mildly reproachful look. "Sarah, what have we said about respecting people's privacy? No peeking into neighbors' yards." "I wasn't peeking exactly. I just wanted to see who was playing. Maybe they could come over sometime." The words came out more wistfully than Sarah had intended. She'd had trouble making friends since they'd moved here. Most of the kids in the neighborhood were either much younger or teenagers who weren't interested in hanging out with a 6th grader. Claire's expression softened. "Oh, honey, I know the summer can feel long. Why don't we look into some day camps? There must be something still open for July." She picked up her phone again, presumably to add it to her endless to-do list. Sarah pushed her plate away, no longer hungry. "It's okay, Mom. I like reading in the yard." It wasn't exactly a lie. She did like reading. She just wished she had someone to talk to about the books afterward. Later that night, Sarah lay in bed with her window open, letting in the cooler evening air. Her room faced the Walsh house, and through the gap in her curtains, She could see the dim glow of lights behind Mrs. Walsh's drawn shades. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, the laughter came again, the same bright, clear sound she'd heard that afternoon. But this time, it was followed by something else. The soft, tinny quality of music that reminded Sarah of the antique music box her grandmother kept on her dresser. Sarah sat up in bed, fully awake now. The sound was exactly the same as before, not similar, but identical down to the pattern of giggles and the "you can't catch me." She reached for her notebook on the bedside table, the one where she kept story ideas and observations. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote, Tuesday, June 15th, children's laughter at Mrs. Walsh's house. 3:15 p.m. and 10:22 p.m. Exactly the same both times. She underlined exactly twice, then added, no children visible in yard. The sounds faded away again, leaving only the normal nighttime noises of crickets and distant traffic. Sarah lay back down, but sleep was a long time coming. She kept thinking about Mrs. Walsh's house, with its drawn curtains and perfect roses and the mystery of laughter that played like a recording on repeat. Just before she finally drifted off, Sarah remembered something she'd noticed but hadn't really processed earlier. The children's voices had sounded old-fashioned somehow, like characters in the black and white TV shows her grandmother sometimes watched. Their accent was different, crisper, more formal, and their words had that slight echo that old recordings always seemed to have. But that was silly, wasn't it? Why would anyone play recordings of children laughing? In her last conscious moments, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow, she would start paying closer attention to the house next door. She would write down every time she heard the laughter, every movement behind the curtains, every coming and going. Maybe there was nothing strange happening at all, but the detective in her latest mystery novel always said that writing things down was the first step to solving any puzzle. She couldn't have known then how important her notebook would become, or how her summer of careful observation would ultimately unravel a mystery far more complex and heartbreaking than anything she could have imagined. By the third week of June, Sarah's notebook had developed a precise schedule of the laughter. The first daily occurrence was always at 7:15 a.m., just as she was getting ready for summer school. The second came at 3:15 p.m., when the afternoon heat was at its peak. The final replay, and Sarah was now certain it was a replay, occurred at 10:22 p.m., like a peculiar bedtime ritual. Day 15, she wrote in her notebook, using her best cursive. Same pattern. Located source of "you can't catch me." It's coming from the second-floor window, east side. Mrs. Walsh's lights were on at 4 a.m. again. Sarah sat cross-legged on her window seat, squinting through her binoculars at the Walsh house. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Victorians' weather-worn shingles, highlighting the peeling paint around the window frames. She'd borrowed the binoculars from her father's study, justifying it as necessary research equipment. A movement caught her eye, Mrs. Walsh in her garden, as predictable as the recorded laughter. The elderly woman wore her usual outfit, a faded floral house dress and a wide-brimmed straw hat, even though the sun had barely cleared the horizon. She moved between her roses with deliberate steps, speaking softly to herself or perhaps to the flowers. Sarah adjusted the focus, noticing how Mrs. Walsh's hands trembled as she worked. Every few minutes, the old woman would pause and look over her shoulder at something Sarah couldn't see, nodding as if responding to an unheard question. "Honey, what are you doing?" Sarah jumped, nearly dropping the binoculars. Her mother stood in the doorway, already dressed for work in her charcoal gray suit, looking concerned. "Bird watching," Sarah said quickly, lowering the binoculars. "There's a cardinal family nesting in the oak tree." Claire Mitchell sighed, crossing the room to sit beside her daughter. "Sarah, you're watching Mrs. Walsh again, aren't you?" She placed a gentle hand on Sarah's knee. "I know you're curious about the sounds you've been hearing, but spying on our neighbors isn't the answer." "But Mom, something's wrong," Sarah protested, flipping open her notebook. "Look, I've been keeping track. The laughter plays at exactly the same times every day, and it's always the same recording. And Mrs. Walsh is acting strange. Last night she was in her garden at 4 in the morning, talking to someone who wasn't there, Claire scanned the neat rows of observations, her expression shifting from mild concern to something more serious. "You've been staying up until 4 in the morning?" "No, I just happened to wake up and saw her through my window." Sarah pointed to her latest entry. "And look at this, yesterday, I saw shadows moving past the upstairs windows, but they were too small to be Mrs. Walsh. They looked like children, but we never see any children actually going in or out of the house." "Sarah," her mother's voice took on the firm tone that meant the conversation was about to end. "I know you have an active imagination, and I love that about you. But Mrs. Walsh is a private person who deserves her privacy. Maybe she has a radio playing, or maybe she likes to watch old home movies. It's not our business. But, no buts. I want you to promise me you'll stop this surveillance and give your father back his binoculars." Claire stood up, smoothing her skirt. "Why don't you spend some time at the library today? They're having a summer reading program that might be fun." Sarah slumped against the window. "Fine," she mumbled, though she had no intention of stopping her investigation. Her mother paused at the door. "And Sarah, try to make some real friends this summer. Okay? Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that you've been eating lunch alone at summer school." After her mother left, Sarah returned to her observation post, this time without the binoculars. Mrs. Walsh had finished with her roses and was standing completely still in the middle of her garden, head tilted as if listening intently. As Sarah watched, the old woman suddenly smiled and reached out her hands, as if to take the hands of invisible children. Just then, right on schedule at 7:15 a.m., the laughter began playing. Mrs. Walsh started swaying gently, conducting an unseen orchestra with her gardening shears. The movement caused her hat to slip, revealing hair that hadn't been properly brushed in what looked like days. Sarah wrote in her notebook, "She's dancing with them. She thinks they're real." Throughout the rest of the morning, Sarah noticed other oddities she might have missed if she hadn't been paying such close attention. The grocery delivery man came as usual, but instead of his normal quick drop-off, he spent several minutes knocking and calling through the mail slot before Mrs. Walsh finally answered. Sarah couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw the delivery man's troubled expression as he left. At summer school that afternoon, Sarah found herself distracted from Mrs. Rodriguez's math lesson by thoughts of the Walsh house. She began sketching a floor plan of the Victorian in her notebook, marking the windows where she'd seen movement and the spots where the laughter seemed loudest. "Sarah?" The answer to question 12. She looked up to find Mrs. Rodriguez and the rest of the class staring at her. Sorry? What was the question?" After class, Mrs. Rodriguez asked her to stay behind. Sarah expected another lecture about paying attention, but instead, the counselor studied her with kind eyes. "Is everything okay at home, Sarah? You seem distracted lately." Sarah hesitated. Mrs. Rodriguez was different from other adults. She actually listened when kids talked. But would she just dismiss Sarah's concerns like everyone else? "Can I tell you something weird?" Sarah asked finally. "Something that might sound crazy?" Mrs. Rodriguez pulled up a chair. "Those are often the most important things to tell." Sarah opened her notebook and began to explain. She told Mrs. Rodriguez everything: the scheduled laughter, Mrs. Walsh's strange behavior, the moving shadows, the 4 a.m. gardening sessions. As she spoke, she watched the counselor's face carefully for signs of disbelief. But Mrs. Rodriguez didn't laugh or dismiss her concerns. Instead, she asked careful questions. How long had this been going on? Had Sarah ever seen any actual children? What exactly did the laughter sound like? Would you be able to record it? Mrs. Rodriguez asked finally. "The laughter, on your phone." Sarah brightened. "I can try. It always plays at 3:15. That's..." She checked the clock. "In about 20 minutes. Let's take a walk," Mrs. Rodriguez suggested, standing up. Past Mrs. Walsh's house. Sometimes it helps to have a second set of eyes and ears. As they walked the 3 blocks to Maple Grove Avenue, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Finally, an adult was taking her seriously. But as they approached the Walsh house, something was different. The front door stood wide open, letting the afternoon heat pour into the dim interior. and instead of the usual recorded laughter, they heard something else. A child crying, high and frightened, followed by Mrs. Walsh's voice calling out, "Mama's coming, darlings. Mama will make it all better." Mrs. Rodriguez grabbed Sarah's arm. "Stay here," she said firmly, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police." Sarah stood rooted to the spot as Mrs. Rodriguez made the call, her heart pounding. Through the open door, she could see movement in the shadowy foyer, small shapes darting past, too quick to make out clearly. The crying continued, but now it seemed to be coming from multiple sources, overlapping like the layers of an echo. Then Mrs. Walsh appeared in the doorway, her white hair wild around her face. She was still wearing her gardening clothes, but now they were smeared with what looked like food and dirt. In her arms, she cradled something that Sarah couldn't quite see. "Mrs. Walsh," Sarah called out, taking a step forward despite Mrs. Rodriguez's warning grip on her shoulder. The old woman's head snapped up, her eyes focusing on Sarah with startling clarity. "You can hear them too, can't you?" she asked, her voice trembling with excitement. "You can hear my children playing?" Before Sarah could answer, Mrs. Walsh retreated into the house, pulling the door closed with a decisive click. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by the familiar recorded laughter, right on schedule at 3:15 p.m. Sarah looked up at Mrs. Rodriguez, whose face had gone pale. "I've been hearing ghost children, haven't I?" she whispered. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head slowly, still staring at the closed door. "No, Sarah. I'm afraid this might be something much worse than ghosts." In the distance, they could hear police sirens approaching, their wail mixing with the cheerful sound of children's laughter that continued to play behind the Walsh house's drawn curtains, oblivious to the darkness that was about to be revealed. Eleanor Walsh's day began, as it had for the past 47 years, with the sound of children laughing. Only now, instead of rushing downstairs to make breakfast for her own children, she carefully adjusted the ancient tape player's volume, ensuring the beloved sounds filled every corner of the Victorian home through the speaker system her late husband had installed decades ago. "Good morning, my darlings," she called out, her trembling hands smoothing the wrinkles from her house dress. The mirror in her bedroom showed a woman she sometimes failed to recognize: thin white hair, deep lines around her mouth, eyes that didn't quite focus the way they used to. But her children wouldn't care about that. Children love unconditionally, don't they? The youngest one, Tommy, peeked around the doorframe. "Morning, Gran," he whispered, thumb firmly planted in his mouth. Eleanor smiled at the 4-year-old, pretending not to notice how his image flickered like a candle flame, overlapping with memories of her own Tommy at that age, playing hide and seek in these same hallways. "Breakfast time," she announced to the empty hallway. "Katie, Michael, come down now, dears. You know the schedule." The schedule was everything. Eleanor had learned that in the 6 months since Jennifer had left the children with her, her granddaughter had promised to return in a week. "Just needed to sort some things out," she'd said, eyes darting nervously around the kitchen. Eleanor hadn't seen her since, but that was fine. She understood about needing time. Hadn't she herself needed time after Charles died? The children were safe with her. They were loved. In the kitchen, Eleanor began her morning routine. 6 bowls of cereal, 3 real, 3 pretend. The children from the recordings needed to eat too, after all. They were all her children now, separated only by thin layers of time that seemed increasingly permeable. "Eat up, Katie," she urged the 6-year-old, who sat picking at her Cheerios. The real Katie, not the one from the tapes, although sometimes Eleanor had trouble telling the difference. Growing girls need their breakfast. Katie glanced toward her older brother Michael, who sat reading a dog-eared copy of The Hardy Boys he'd found in the attic. At 8, he had appointed himself protector of his younger siblings, a role that manifested mainly in silence and watchful eyes. Gran," he said carefully, using the name they'd adopted after Jennifer left them here. "The milk's gone bad again." Eleanor blinked at the bowls, noticing for the first time the sour smell and yellowed color of the milk. When had she bought it? The days blended together lately, marked only by the regular deliveries and the scheduled playings of her precious recordings. Not to worry, darling. We'll have dry cereal today. Like camping. She began humming along with the tape playing overhead children's voices from 1962. Her own babies playing in this very kitchen. The sound system Charles had installed still worked perfectly, filling every room with memories. Michael exchanged another look with Katie, one of many silent conversations Eleanor pretended not to notice. She busied herself instead with the morning medications. So many pills these days, though she couldn't always remember what they were for. Some days she forgot to take them entirely, and those were the days when past and present braided together most completely, when she could almost believe all her children were here at once, playing together across the decades. The doorbell rang, the grocery delivery. Eleanor froze, her hand halfway to her mouth with the morning's pills. The children knew the drill. Up to the secret playroom quickly and quietly. No one could know they were here. Jennifer had been very clear about that. Social services, she'd said, her hands shaking as she'd handed over Tommy. They'll take them away. You won't let that happen, will you, Grandma? Eleanor watched as Michael led his siblings upstairs, their feet silent on the carpeted steps from years of practice. Such good children, so well behaved. Not like the ones on the recordings who laughed and shouted with abandon. The doorbell rang again, more insistently. Eleanor hurried to answer it, plastering on her company smile. The delivery man, Ryan, looked concerned today. Mrs. Walsh, he said, holding out the weekly groceries. Are you feeling all right? I thought I heard children in there. Just the radio, she said smoothly, the lie familiar on her tongue. I like the company, he hesitated. Mrs. Walsh, some of the neighbors have been worried. Maybe I could come in for a minute, help you put these away. No, the word came out sharper than she'd intended. Eleanor softened her voice. No, thank you. I'm quite capable. Just a bit tired today. She took the groceries and closed the door firmly, letting out a shaky breath. Through the peephole, she watched him stand there for a long moment before finally turning away. She would need to be more careful. The neighbors were watching, especially that girl next door with her binoculars and notebook. The rest of the morning passed in its usual routine. Eleanor helped Tommy with his letters while Katie drew pictures and Michael read. The other children, the ones from the tapes, played their endless game of tag upstairs, their laughter a comforting soundtrack to the day. But something was wrong. The edges of things seemed blurrier than usual, and Eleanor kept losing track of which children were real and which were memories. Had she given Tommy his bath last night? When was the last time she'd done laundry? There were piles of dishes in the sink that she didn't remember using. Time for your medicine, Gran, Michael said, startling her from her thoughts. He held out her pill organizer, the one Charles had bought her before. Before what? She couldn't remember. Such a thoughtful boy, she murmured, taking the pills obediently. Just like your grandfather. I never met grandfather, Michael said quietly. He died before I was born. Eleanor stared at him, confused. That couldn't be right. Charles had just been here yesterday, installing the speakers, saying how the children would love having music in every room. The afternoon heat was oppressive, making it hard to think. Eleanor found herself in the garden without quite remembering how she got there, talking to children who flickered in and out of existence like fireflies. The roses needed pruning. Charles had always said a well-tended garden was a sign of a well-tended mind. Mrs. Walsh, a voice called out, the girl from next door. Eleanor turned to see her standing with a woman she didn't recognize. Why were they looking at her like that? And why was the front door open? Tommy was crying upstairs. No, not Tommy. The Tommy from the tapes. But she could see him, couldn't she? Right there on the stairs, holding his scratched knee from when he fell in 1962. You can hear them too? Can't you? She asked the girl eagerly. You can hear my children playing? But the girl's face showed only fear, and Eleanor suddenly remembered she wasn't supposed to talk about the children. Jennifer would be angry. She hurried inside, clutching her treasured ragdoll. When had she picked that up? And closed the door against the concerned faces outside. The recorded laughter began playing right on schedule, but it sounded different now, distorted and wrong. Eleanor sank to the floor, holding her head in her hands. Something was wrong with the timing, with the borders between then and now. She could hear sirens in the distance. "Michael," she called out, her voice shaking. "Katie? Tommy? We're here, Gran," Michael answered, appearing at her side. His small hand found hers, solid and warm and real. "We're all here." Eleanor squeezed his hand, anchoring herself to the present moment. She could hear people at the door now, official-sounding voices asking her to open up. But she couldn't, could she? She had to protect the children. All of them, the ones from now and then, real and recorded, living and remembered. "It's okay," Michael said softly, as Katie and Tommy joined them in the foyer. "Maybe it's time to let someone help us." Eleanor looked at her great-grandchildren, really looked at them for the first time in what might have been days. Their unwashed hair, their too small clothes, the worry in their young eyes. When had she last bought them new clothes? Had she remembered to feed them lunch today? The recorded laughter played on overhead, but Eleanor finally heard it for what it was, an echo of the past, not a promise of the present. As the knocking at the door grew more insistent, she pulled all three children close, breathing in the very real scent of their unwashed hair and sweaty skin. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was apologizing to them or to her own children, long grown and gone. "I'm so sorry." Then she stood up on shaky legs and, still holding Tommy's small hand, walked to the door to face whatever came next. Detective Laura Chun had responded to hundreds of welfare checks in her 15 years with the Millbrook Police Department, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the school counselor's carefully controlled voice when she called it in, or the way the 11-year-old witness clutched her notebook like a shield. Or perhaps it was the haunting sound of children's laughter drifting from the old Victorians' open windows, too crisp and clear to be coming from actual kids. "Mrs. Walsh." She knocked firmly on the heavy oak door. "This is Detective Chun with the Millbrook Police. We need to speak with you." Beside her, Officer Marcus Torres shifted uncomfortably in the summer heat. "Kids are definitely in there," he murmured. "I can hear movement upstairs." Sarah Mitchell, the young neighbor who'd first reported her concerns, stood on the sidewalk with her counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez. The girl was still writing in her notebook, documenting everything with remarkable attention to detail. "Mrs. Walsh, we're coming in." Chun nodded to Torres, who began working on the lock. The laughter track, and Chun was now certain it was a recording, played on, creating an eerie soundtrack to their entry. The foyer smelled of dust and roses, with an underlying hint of spoiled food. Chen's flashlight beam revealed walls covered in photographs, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, spanning what looked like several decades. Children in varying styles of clothes, from black and white images of the 1960s to color Polaroids of the 80s, all showing the same 3 or 4 kids at different ages. "Police! Mrs. Walsh!" Torres called out, his hand resting cautiously on his holster. They found her in the living room, sitting in an antique armchair with 3 children huddled close to her. The oldest, a boy of about 8, stood slightly in front of his siblings in a protective stance. All 3 kids were unwashed but appeared physically unharmed. "Hello, officers." Mrs. Walsh's voice was surprisingly steady. "I suppose you're here about the children." Chun approached slowly, noting the woman's disheveled appearance and unfocused gaze. "Yes, ma'am. We received a call about some concerns. Could you tell me who these children are?" "They're mine," Mrs. Walsh said, then corrected herself. "My great-grandchildren. Jennifer's children. She'll be back for them soon." The oldest boy spoke up, his voice quiet but clear. "Mom left us here 6 months ago. She said it was just for a week." Chun exchanged a glance with Torres, who was already radioing for CPS. She knelt down to the children's eye level. "Can you tell me your names?" "I'm Michael," the boy said. "This is Katie. She's 6 and Tommy's 4. He hesitated, then added, Gran tries her best, but she gets confused sometimes. She thinks we're her other children too." As if on cue, the recording of children's laughter started again, playing through hidden speakers. Mrs. Walsh smiled vaguely at the sound. "That's my Tommy too," she said. "From before." Charles set up the speakers so we could always hear them playing. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Child Protective Services arrived, along with paramedics to evaluate Mrs. Walsh. Chun, supervised as Torres, and another officer conducted a thorough search of the house, documenting the conditions and gathering evidence. The house told a story of gradual decline. The kitchen contained expired food and unwashed dishes. Upstairs, they found 3 children's beds in various states of disarray, along with a sophisticated sound system that played recordings at preset times throughout the day. But it was the attic that held the biggest surprise. A carefully preserved playroom contained toys and clothes from multiple decades, along with boxes of old recordings, vinyl records, reel-to-reel tapes, and cassettes, all meticulously labeled with dates and names. "Look at this," Torres called out, holding up a journal. She's been keeping daily logs for years. Lists of when her own kids played, what games they played, what they said. She recreated it all with the great-grandchildren. Same schedule, same games, same everything. Chun was examining a stack of more recent papers. "We've got bank statements here. The grandmother, Jennifer's mother, died last year and left everything to Mrs. Walsh. She's been living off that money, having groceries delivered, keeping the utilities on." She paused, reading further. "But the accounts are almost empty now." A paramedic appeared in the attic doorway. "Detective, Mrs. Walsh is asking for you. She seems to be having a moment of clarity." Chun found Mrs. Walsh sitting on the living room sofa, looking suddenly older and very tired. The 3 children had been taken to the kitchen where a CPS worker was giving them fresh food and conducting preliminary interviews. "I know what year it is now," Mrs. Walsh said as Chun sat down across from her. 2025. Not 1962. Not 1975. Not any of the other years I've been living in. She twisted her hands in her lap. "Are they going to take the children?" "Yes, ma'am. At least temporarily. They need proper care while we sort this out. I tried to take care of them. I did. But the days, they stop making sense sometimes. Past and present, all mixed up together." She looked at Chun with surprising lucidity. "Will they go to jail? Jennifer and Charles Jr.? Charles Jr., my son, Jennifer's father. He knows where she is. He's been sending money sometimes, telling me to keep quiet about the children." Mrs. Walsh pulled a phone from her pocket, an old flip phone, and handed it to Chun. "The messages are all there. I think Jennifer's in trouble. The kind of trouble she's been in before. But Charles Jr. just wants to pretend everything's fine, like he always has." Chun took the phone carefully. "We'll look into it, Mrs. Walsh. Right now, let's focus on getting you and the children the help you need." Mrs. Walsh nodded, then cocked her head as if listening. The recorded laughter had stopped, leaving the house in uncomfortable silence. "I always thought if I could just keep them all here, the past children, the present children, then nothing bad could happen. Nothing could change." She smiled sadly. "Silly, isn't it? Everything changes." Later, as Chun watched the CPS workers leading the children to their car, she noticed Sarah Mitchell still standing on the sidewalk, writing in her notebook. The girl looked up as Chun approached. "Did I do the right thing?" Sarah asked. "By telling?" Chun thought about the empty bank accounts, the expired food, the gradually deteriorating conditions that could have become dangerous. She thought about 3 children living in a time warp, trying to compete with ghosts from their great-grandmother's past. "Yes," she said firmly. "You absolutely did the right thing. You might have saved their lives." Sarah nodded, then looked back at her notebook. "What happens now?" "Now," Chun said, watching Mrs. Walsh being helped into an ambulance, "we try to put all the pieces back together. The real pieces, not the remembered ones." The girl wrote something down, then read aloud. The laughter stops, but the story continues. Chun couldn't have put it better herself. The Millbrook Police Department's conference room had become a makeshift command center for what the media was already calling the Walsh House case. Detective Chun sat surrounded by documents, photographs, and sticky notes, trying to construct a timeline that spanned 3 generations of family trauma. "Okay, walk me through it again," Captain Rivera said, studying the whiteboard where Chun had mapped out the Walsh family tree. Start with the original recordings. Chun picked up the earliest dated journal. 1962 to 1975. Eleanor Walsh recorded her children playing Charles Jr., Margaret, and Rebecca. Every day, multiple times a day. At first, it seems like normal home recordings, the kind any mother might make. But after Charles Sr. installed the whole house sound system in '65, it became more systematic. She opened the journal to a marked page. Listen to this entry from December 1967. Children's laughter must be preserved. When they grow up, they'll forget how to laugh like this. But I'll remember for them. I'll keep it safe. Torres entered with fresh coffee and a stack of financial records. Got something on the grandson-in-law, he said, handing Chen a document. Jennifer's husband, Mark Stevens. 3 rehab stints in the past decade, multiple arrests for possession. Last known address is a halfway house in Hartford. And Jennifer? Still no sign of her. But I tracked down her prescription history. Torres tapped his tablet. Multiple doctors, multiple pharmacies. Classic doctor shopping pattern. Oxycodone mainly. She was getting clean during her last pregnancy with Tommy, but relapsed about a year ago. Chun added this information to the timeline. The pattern was becoming clearer. 3 generations of a family trying to outrun their demons. Charles Jr., now a successful businessman in Boston, had spent his adult life distancing himself from his mother's increasing obsession with preserving the past. His own daughter, Jennifer, had fallen into addiction, possibly trying to escape the weight of her grandmother's fixation on childhood perfection. What about the children's father? Rivera asked. Mark Stevens is cooperating, Chun replied. Says Jennifer showed up at the halfway house 6 months ago, told him she'd left the kids with their great-grandmother temporarily. He assumed she meant for a weekend. Not. She gestured at the stack of evidence photos showing the children's living conditions. He didn't check on them. Says he wasn't allowed contact with the kids after his last relapse. Court orders. Chun rubbed her temples. The thing is, everyone involved thought someone else was handling it. Charles Jr. sent money but never visited. Mark assumed Jennifer had it under control. Jennifer's sister in California thought they were living with their father. Meanwhile, Mrs. Walsh's dementia was progressing, and 3 kids were living in a time capsule. Sarah Mitchell's detailed notebook had proved invaluable in establishing the pattern of decline. The girls' observations, spanning several weeks, showed how Mrs. Walsh's behavior had become increasingly erratic. The scheduled recordings had become more frequent, the boundaries between past and present children blurring in her mind. Chen's phone buzzed, a text from the children's temporary foster mother. She opened the attached photo and smiled despite the heaviness of the case. It showed Michael, Katie, and Tommy at the park, genuinely laughing for what might have been the first time in months. Real laughter, not the preserved echoes of their relatives from decades past. Dr. Harrison called from the geriatric psychiatric unit. Torres said, checking his notes. Mrs. Walsh is responding well to medication and therapy. She's more lucid, though she's having trouble processing what happened. Keeps apologizing to her old recordings, saying she failed to keep them safe. Chun stood up, stretching tired muscles. And Charles Jr.? Arriving tomorrow morning. His lawyer says he's willing to cooperate fully, probably hoping to avoid charges of child endangerment by proxy. Bring him straight to me, Chun said, studying the family tree again. I want to understand how it got this far. How an entire family could hear children's laughter for decades without realizing it had become a cry for help. Later that evening, Chun drove past the Walsh house. City workers had finally shut off the ancient sound system, but she could swear she still heard echoes of those recorded voices. Sarah Mitchell sat on her own front porch, writing in a new notebook. She waved as Chun passed. The detective waved back, thinking about how one child's attention to detail had saved 3 others. Sometimes it took an outsider to hear the wrong notes in what everyone else had accepted as normal background music. Her phone buzzed again, another update from the foster family. Michael had asked for his great-grandmother's old copy of The Hardy Boys, Not out of obligation this time, but simply because he wanted to know how the story ended. It was a small thing, Chin thought, but perhaps the beginning of his own story, one without scheduled performances or preserved perfection. Real stories, after all, were messy and unpredictable. They couldn't be captured in recordings or played on repeat. They had to be lived, moment by moment, with all their imperfect laughter and unexpected tears. Chun made a final note in her case file. The Walsh recordings have stopped. The healing can begin. Charles Walsh Jr. sat across from Detective Chun in the interview room, every inch the Boston executive in his tailored suit and carefully maintained silver hair. But his manicured hands couldn't stop fidgeting with his wedding ring, turning it around and around as he spoke about his daughter. Jennifer was always sensitive, he said, staring at the case photos spread across the table. Like my mother in that way. They both felt things too deeply. He picked up a school photo of Jennifer from her teenage years. All awkward smile and braces, trying too hard to please. I thought sending her to boarding school would help. Structure, you know? Distance from my mother's eccentricities. Chun let the silence stretch, watching him struggle with memories he'd clearly worked hard to bury. Finally, he placed the photo back on the table with trembling fingers. When did you last see your daughter? Chun asked. Christmas. No, Thanksgiving. He frowned. She seemed better. The kids were clean, well-behaved. Mother was, well, more confused than usual, but she had good days still. Jennifer said they were just staying temporarily, until she found a new apartment. Did you know your mother had been diagnosed with early-onset dementia 3 years ago? Charles's head snapped up. What? No, that's impossible. I spoke to her doctor. Her former doctor, Chun corrected, sliding a report across the table. She stopped attending appointments 2 years ago. Around the same time Jennifer relapsed. The color drained from Charles's face as he read the medical report. Oh God, he whispered. The money I sent, I thought it was for the kids' expenses. But she was paying for Jennifer's prescriptions. Wasn't she? Among other things, Chun pulled out her phone, playing a voicemail recovered from Mrs. Walsh's old flip phone. Jennifer's voice, slurred and desperate, asking for more money, promising to come home soon, just a few more days, just until she got everything figured out. Charles put his head in his hands. I didn't want to see it. Any of it. Just like when I was a kid. Easier to pretend everything was fine. That mother's recordings were normal, that Jennifer's headaches were really headaches. A knock at the door interrupted his self-recrimination. Officer Torres entered with a fresh report. We found her, he said quietly. Jennifer Stevens was discovered in a motel outside Hartford, unconscious but alive. The room was littered with empty pill bottles and a journal full of rambling apologies to her children. She'd been tracking them through social media, using a fake account to follow Sarah Mitchell's public posts about the mysterious house next door. She knew, Torres explained, reading from the journal. She knew her grandmother was declining, that the kids weren't safe, but she couldn't face it. Says here she'd sit in her car down the street sometimes, listening to those same recordings she grew up with, trying to work up the courage to go in. Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need to see her. She's in intensive care, Chun said. And when she's stable, she'll face charges. Child endangerment, prescription fraud. I'll pay for the best lawyers, the best rehab facility. Charles started, but Chun cut him off. Mr. Walsh, throwing money at problems is what got us here. Your mother needed medical care, not just grocery delivery. Jennifer needed intervention, not secret prescriptions. Those kids needed a stable home, not a time capsule of preserved happiness. Charles sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every bit his 60 years. What can I do? Help us understand, Chun said, softening her tone. Start with the recordings. When did they begin? When did you first realize they weren't just home movies? Over the next 2 hours, Charles unspooled a lifetime of carefully buried memories. His father installing the sound system as a gift, not realizing it would become the centerpiece of his wife's growing obsession. The scheduled playback times that structured their days. His mother's increasing insistence that happiness could be preserved if they just followed the routine, played the right recordings, recreated the perfect moments. She meant well, he said finally. She loved us so much it broke something in her. And then Jennifer inherited that broken piece, that need to make everything perfect even when it was falling apart. And the kids? Your grandchildren. Charles stared at the recent photos of Michael, Katie, and Tommy. I'll do whatever you recommend. The right way this time. No shortcuts, no cover-ups. Chin nodded, making notes. They need stability, professional help processing what they've been through. And eventually, when Jennifer's gotten proper treatment, supervised visitation might be possible. And my mother? The geriatric psychiatric unit is helping her adjust to medication. She's more lucid now, able to distinguish past from present. She asks about the children. Chun paused. They miss her too, you know. Not the confused woman lost in old recordings, but the grandmother who read them stories and taught them about roses. Charles pulled out his wallet, removing a worn photograph. It showed a much younger Eleanor Walsh in her garden, laughing naturally as she played with a toddler Jennifer. No recordings, no scheduled performances, just a genuine moment of joy. I'd forgotten she could laugh like that, he said softly. Really laugh, not just playback echoes. It's not too late, Chin said, for any of them, but it needs to be real this time. No more preserved perfect moments. No more pretending everything's fine. Outside the interview room, Sarah Mitchell sat with her mother, giving a formal statement about her observations. The girl had become something of a local hero, her careful documentation helping piece together the timeline of deterioration that everyone else had missed. Sometimes, Charles said, watching Sarah through the window, it takes a child to remind us what real childhood should look like. Chan thought about Michael's recent request for art supplies, Katie's first playdate with Sarah, Tommy's delight in making new recordings of his own voice, not to preserve perfect moments, but simply to hear how silly he could make it sound. The healing process will take time, she told Charles, for all of them, but real healing is messy and imperfect. Can't be scheduled or preserved. It has to be lived. Charles nodded, finally stopping the nervous twisting of his ring. Like real laughter, he said, you can't really save it. You can only make room for more. The psychiatric ward of Hartford General was painted in what Jennifer Stevens assumed were supposed to be soothing colors, soft blues and gentle greens that reminded her of the nursery she'd painted for Tommy, back when she still believed she could be the kind of mother who got things right. She sat in the community room, watching rain trace patterns on the window while her group therapy session continued around her. Jennifer. Dr. Patel's voice was gentle but insistent. Would you like to share your thoughts about your children's visit yesterday? She touched the craft paper bracelet on her wrist, a gift from Katie, covered in wobbly hearts and carefully written words. Get better soon, Mom. Michael had added his own message in his neat handwriting. We're okay. Take your time. They've grown, she said finally, her voice rough from disuse. Tommy's almost as tall as Katie now. And Michael, he looks so much older. 6 months. She'd lost 6 months of their lives to a haze of pills and fear, leaving them in a house where time had stopped making sense. The guilt threatened to overwhelm her again, but she used the grounding techniques Dr. Patel had taught her, focusing on the present moment. What else did you notice about them? Dr. Patel prompted. They're laughing again, Jennifer said, surprising herself with the observation. Real laughing, not like... She trailed off, remembering the recordings that had haunted her childhood, her grandmother's obsession with preserving perfect moments that never really existed. A nurse appeared in the doorway, gesturing to Dr. Patel. Miss Stevens, your father is here. Jennifer's hands began trembling. She hadn't seen her father since that last Thanksgiving, when she'd still been pretending everything was under control. Dr. Patel noticed her anxiety. Would you like to wait until tomorrow? There's no rush, but Jennifer shook her head. No, I need to face this. All of it. Charles Walsh Jr. had lost weight. She noticed as he entered the room. The perfectly pressed suit couldn't hide how tired he looked, how the past months had aged him. He stood awkwardly by the door until she gestured to the chair across from her. "You look better," he said, then winced at his own words. "Better than unconscious in a motel room, you mean?" The bitterness surprised her. She'd practiced this conversation for weeks in therapy, but seeing him brought back every unresolved hurt. "Jenny?" He reached for her hand, then stopped himself. "I'm sorry. For everything. For not seeing what was happening. For teaching you to hide problems instead of facing them. Like you did with Grandma?" The words came out sharp, weighted with decades of carefully maintained silence. He didn't flinch. "Yes, exactly like that. I left you alone with her obsessions, just like my father left me alone with them. We all just pretended it was normal. Those endless recordings, the scheduled performances of happiness." Jennifer closed her eyes, remembering. "She made me play the same games they played in the recordings. Wear similar clothes. Learn the same songs. Said she was keeping childhood alive. But she was really trying to stop time. And then I sent you away to school instead of getting her help." "Instead of getting you help?" Charles's voice cracked. "When did the pills start?" "Sophomore year. Headaches at first. Then anxiety. Then," she gestured vaguely, "everything else. It was easier to float away than feel all the pressure to be perfect, to be preserved in amber like those recordings." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the rain. Finally, Charles spoke again. "Your grandmother is doing better. The doctors say the medication is helping her distinguish past from present. She asks about you." Jennifer twisted Katie's bracelet around her wrist. "I keep thinking about the kids. How I left them there, knowing she was slipping. I told myself they were safe, that it was temporary. But really I just couldn't face any of it anymore. The social worker says they're resilient," Charles offered. "The foster family is good for them. And Michael," he started writing his own stories. "No more trying to live inside old ones." A memory surfaced. Michael at 6, listening intently to the ancient recordings while Grandma explained who each voice belonged to, what games they were playing, how everything was perfect back then. She'd seen him trying so hard to match those long-ago children, to be what his great-grandmother needed him to be. "I have to break the cycle," Jennifer said firmly. "For them. No more preserved perfect moments. No more pretending. No more running away into numbness. They deserve better." Dr. Patel, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "And what do you deserve, Jennifer?" The question caught her off guard. She looked at her father, seeing the pain and regret in his eyes, the weight of 3 generations of unspoken trauma. "I deserve to heal," she said slowly. "To learn how to be present instead of perfect. To laugh with my children instead of making them perform happiness." Charles nodded, tears sliding down his cheeks. "We all do." Later, after her father left, Jennifer sat with Dr. Patel reviewing her treatment plan. The road ahead was long therapy, addiction recovery, supervised visitation, rebuilding trust. But for the first time, she felt anchored in reality instead of drowning in preserved echoes of the past. "Your daughter Katie," Dr. Patel said, "she told me something interesting yesterday. She said she likes your new laugh better than your old one." "My new laugh?" "Yes. She said it sounds more real, like you really mean it." Jennifer touched the paper bracelet again, tracing the wobbly hearts. Outside, the rain had stopped, and weak sunlight filtered through the hospital windows. Somewhere in Millbrook, her children were living their own unscripted moments, creating their own authentic sounds of joy. It was time, she decided, to learn how to join them in the present. Michael sat cross-legged on his new bedroom floor, carefully arranging his collection of Hardy Boys books in chronological order. Through the open window of the foster home, he could hear Tommy and Katie playing in the backyard with their foster siblings, their laughter mixing with the natural sounds of a summer afternoon lawnmowers, birds, the ice cream truck's distant jingle. No schedules, no recordings, no prescribed moments of joy. "Hey, buddy," Mark Wilson, his foster father, appeared in the doorway. "Sarah's here to see you." Michael looked up to see Sarah Mitchell hovering behind Mr. Wilson, clutching her ever-present notebook and what looked like some kind of electronic device. "I brought something," she said, stepping into the room. "If you want to see it," Mr. Wilson smiled. "I'll be downstairs if you need anything." Once he left, Sarah sat down next to Michael, placing her notebook and what he now recognized as a digital voice recorder between them. "Mrs. Rodriguez helped me get it," she explained. "I thought maybe you might want to record your own stories?" Michael stared at the recorder, his throat tight. For a moment, all he could hear were the old recordings from the Victorian house, the endless loop of preserved laughter, the voices from the past demanding to be matched, repeated, preserved. "It's okay if you don't want to," Sarah added quickly. "I just thought—" "No, I do," Michael interrupted. "But different. Not like before." He picked up the recorder, turning it over in his hands. "Can I show you something?" He retrieved a notebook from under his bed, not the strict daily logs his great-grandmother had kept, but a blank one given to him by his therapist, Dr. Lewis. Inside were his attempts at writing stories, mostly adventures starring his siblings, but with no prescribed endings, no perfect moments to preserve. "I've been writing about us," he explained. "About what happened, but also about what happens next. Real stories." Sarah's eyes lit up. "Like the Hardy Boys, but about you guys?" "Kind of." Michael flipped through the pages. "But not just solving mysteries. It's about learning to be normal kids again. Tommy had a tantrum at the grocery store last week, and Mrs. Wilson just helped him calm down. She didn't try to make him be quiet or perfect. She said it's okay to have big feelings. Can I read some?" Michael hesitated, then nodded. As Sarah read, he could hear Katie teaching their new foster sister a clapping game in the backyard. It wasn't the same game from the old recordings. This one had different rhythms. Wrong words, imperfect timing. It was better. "These are really good," Sarah said finally. "Especially the part about Tommy discovering he likes spicy food. Gran never let him try it. Did she? She only made the foods her kids liked in the recordings," Michael explained. "But now," he smiled slightly, "now we get to figure out what we actually like." Sarah picked up her voice recorder again. "Maybe we could record you reading these? Not to preserve them or anything, but just to show how stories can change and grow." Downstairs, the front door opened, and Michael heard Dr. Chen's voice talking with the Wilsons. She visited regularly, keeping them updated about their mom's progress in the hospital, their great-grandmother's treatment, their grandfather's efforts to make amends. "They're all getting better," Dr. Chen had told him last week. "And you know why? Because they're finally letting themselves be imperfect." Michael reached for the recorder. "Okay," he said, "but let's start with a new story. About today." He pressed record and began. "The thing about real laughter is that you can't schedule it. It just happens, like Tommy discovering he loves wasabi peas, or Katie making up songs that don't rhyme, or me learning that sad stories can have happy middles even if you don't know the ending yet." Sarah opened her notebook, but instead of her usual detailed observations, she began sketching the sunlight through the window, Tommy's face smeared with ice cream, Katie's mismatched socks. "Keep going," she encouraged. So Michael did, letting the story unfold naturally, without trying to match it to any preserved moment from the past. He recorded the sound of Katie's new clapping game, Tommy's delighted shriek as he bit into another wasabi pea, the Wilsons' patient voices asking what they wanted for dinner. When Dr. Chun came upstairs to check on them, she found Michael and Sarah surrounded by books and papers, the voice recorder capturing their quiet conversation about endings and beginnings, about the difference between preserving moments and living them. "Time for dinner," she announced. "I brought pizza." "With pineapple?" Tommy called from the hallway, where he'd been listening. Gran said pineapple doesn't belong on pizza, but I want to try it. "Half pineapple," Dr. Chun confirmed. "And half whatever else you want to discover." Michael picked up the voice recorder, but instead of stopping it, he let it keep running, capturing the sounds of chairs scraping, plates clinking, his siblings debating pizza toppings, Sarah explaining why she thought pineapple and pepperoni could work together. Real life, real laughter, real stories, no schedules required. Later, when Sarah asked if he wanted to erase the dinner recording to save space, Michael shook his head. "No," he said. "I want to keep it." Not because it's perfect, but because it's true, and that he was learning made all the difference. The geriatric psychiatric unit at Millbrook General had a garden. Not an elaborate one like Eleanor Walsh's prized rose beds, but a simple space with raised planters and comfortable benches. On this crisp September morning, Eleanor sat with her social worker, Ms. Reeves, watching a monarch butterfly explore the late-blooming zinnias. "Are you ready for today?" Ms. Reeves asked, checking her notes. "We can reschedule if you're feeling overwhelmed." Eleanor smoothed her cardigan new, chosen by herself from the hospital shop, not a preserved relic from decades past. "No," she said firmly. "I need to see them. The real them, not the memories." The medication had helped clear the fog that had mixed past and present so completely. Therapy had helped her understand her desperate need to preserve perfect moments, to keep her children forever young and happy through the endless loop of recordings. But nothing had been harder than accepting that her great-grandchildren needed to be their own people, not replacements for long-gone voices on ancient tapes. "Remember your coping strategies," Ms. Reeves said gently. "And if you feel yourself slipping, I focus on something present and concrete," Eleanor finished. "The texture of my sweater, the smell of coffee, the sound of real voices, not recorded ones." The butterfly landed on her hand, wings slowly opening and closing. Eleanor watched it, anchoring herself in the moment. No schedule, no performance, just the simple reality of being. "They're here," Ms. Reeves said softly. Eleanor looked up to see Michael, Katie, and Tommy entering the garden with their foster parents, the Wilsons. Dr. Chun followed close behind, along with Charles Jr., who had flown in from Boston for this supervised visit. Tommy saw her first. Gran. He started forward, then stopped, looking uncertainly at Mrs. Wilson. "It's okay," Mrs. Wilson said. "Remember what we talked about? Real feelings are okay." Tommy ran to Eleanor, wrapping his arms around her waist. She hugged him back, noticing how much he'd grown, the new freckles on his nose, the way he smelled of peanut butter and little boy sweat instead of the carefully preserved cleanliness she'd once insisted upon. "You got new clothes," Katie observed, approaching more cautiously. She touched the soft blue cardigan. "Not the old dresses anymore." "No more old dresses," Eleanor agreed. "No more old anything. Just me as I am now." Michael hung back, studying her with those observant eyes that reminded her so much of her late husband. "The recording stopped," he said. "In the house. Sarah told me they turned off the sound system." Eleanor felt the familiar urge to reassure him, to promise that they could recreate those perfect moments again. Instead, she took a deep breath and said what she'd practiced with her therapist. "Yes, those recordings were memories, not life. I got lost in them for a while, trying to keep everyone safe in amber. But you deserve to make your own sounds, your own memories." Michael's shoulders relaxed slightly. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a digital recorder. "I've been making new recordings," he said. "Not to preserve anything, just to tell stories. Real ones. Would you like to hear?" They sat together on the garden bench, the butterfly still occasionally fluttering nearby, and listened to Michael's clear voice reading his latest story. It was about 3 children discovering their own ways of being happy, with a grandmother who learned to love them as they were, not as echoes of the past. Charles Jr. wiped tears from his eyes as he listened. "Dad would have loved this," he said quietly to Eleanor. "He always said Michael had the gift for stories." "Charles," Eleanor reached for her son's hand. "I'm sorry for making you and your sisters live inside those recordings for so long. For teaching Jennifer to chase perfect moments instead of real ones. Mom, I'm sorry too. For not seeing how much help you needed. For letting history repeat itself with Jennifer and the kids." Tommy, who had been chasing the butterfly, came running back. Gran, can I tell you about wasabi peas? They're spicy and amazing, and I eat them all the time now." Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, unscheduled and imperfect. "Tell me everything." They spent the next hour sharing stories. Katie's new friendship with Sarah Mitchell, Michael's adventures in creative writing, Tommy's culinary discoveries. The Wilsons added their own observations about the children's progress, while Dr. Chun shared updates about Jennifer's recovery. "She's doing well," Dr. Chun said, "taking it one day at a time. The doctors think she might be ready for supervised visits next month." Eleanor noticed how Michael tensed slightly at this news. "It's okay to have mixed feelings," she told him. "About all of us. We broke your trust, and earning it back will take time." "Dr. Lewis says the same thing," Michael replied. "About trust being like a house. Sometimes you have to tear down the broken parts before you can rebuild stronger." A nurse appeared to signal the end of visiting hours. As the children prepared to leave, Tommy hugged Eleanor again. "Will you tell me about the roses next time?" he asked. "Not like before, but maybe you could teach me to grow new ones?" "I'd like that very much," Eleanor said. New roses, new stories, new memories. She watched them leave her son, her great-grandchildren, the caring professionals who had helped unravel her web of preserved perfection. The butterfly made one last circuit around the garden before flying away. Ms. Reeves touched her shoulder. "How are you feeling?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, focusing on the present moment as she'd been taught. "Sad," she said honestly, "but a clean kind of sad. Like pruning roses, it hurts, but it makes room for new growth." As if to punctuate her words, she heard laughter from the parking lot, real, spontaneous laughter as Tommy presumably did something amusing. No recordings needed. Some moments, Eleanor was finally learning, were more beautiful precisely because they couldn't be preserved. 1 year after Sarah Mitchell first heard the mysterious laughter next door, she sat in her window seat watching movers load the last of Mrs. Walsh's furniture into their truck. The Victorian house stood quiet now, its windows open to the autumn breeze, ready for its new owners. "It looks different, doesn't it?" Mrs. Rodriguez said, joining Sarah at the window. The counselor had become a regular visitor, helping Sarah process her role in the events that had unfolded. Happier, Sarah decided, opening her final notebook about the Walsh house. Like it can breathe again. She'd filled 12 notebooks over the past year, documenting everything. The investigation, the children's transition to foster care, Mrs. Walsh's recovery, Jennifer's rehabilitation, and most importantly, the family's slow journey toward healing. The latest entry described yesterday's gathering, a small celebration of Michael's 13th birthday in the Wilsons' backyard. Mrs. Walsh had been there, looking years younger in her casual clothes, helping Tommy plant his first rose bush. Jennifer had attended too, 6 months sober and cautiously rebuilding relationships with her children. Even Charles Jr. had flown in, bringing birthday presents and humble attempts at connection. "Did you record it?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, nodding at the voice recorder that Sarah and Michael still shared for their storytelling projects. "Some," Sarah said. "The important parts. Like when Tommy accidentally sprayed everyone with the garden hose, and Mrs. Walsh just laughed instead of worrying about perfect moments. Or when Katie showed Jennifer her art portfolio, and nobody cared that the drawings weren't exactly right. She pressed play, and Michael's voice filled the room. The thing about happy endings is that they're really just new beginnings in disguise. Like when your mom comes home different, still broken in some places but trying to heal. Or when your great-grandmother learns to love the messy parts of life as much as the perfect ones. Or when your grandfather stops trying to fix everything with money and just listens instead. A knock at the door interrupted the recording. It was Detective Chun, holding a small cardboard box. "Found these during the final sweep of the house," she said, setting the box on Sarah's desk. "Thought you might want them for your records." Inside were the original tapes from 1962, Mrs. Walsh's first recordings of her children playing. Sarah handled them carefully, these artifacts that had sparked decades of preservation attempts. "Mrs. Walsh asked us to donate most of the recordings to a historical society," Chun explained. "But she wanted you to have these. Said something about keeping them safe but not preserved, whatever that means." Sarah understood. These weren't instructions for perfect happiness anymore, just memories of real moments, no more or less precious than the new ones being created every day. Through her window, she could see Michael in his foster family's yard next door, reading to his siblings under the maple tree. Their laughter floated up, natural, unscheduled, alive. I have one last story to tell, Sarah said, picking up her pencil. About how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop trying to keep everything the same. About how love doesn't need to be preserved because it's always growing into new shapes. She wrote the date at the top of a fresh page, then paused. Detective Chun? Do you think they'll be okay? All of them. Chun thought about Jennifer, now working part-time and attending every therapy session. About Mrs. Walsh tending her new, smaller garden with acceptance of its seasonal changes. About Charles Jr. learning to face problems instead of burying them. About 3 children discovering who they were beyond the weight of family history. I think, she said carefully, they're learning that okay doesn't mean perfect. It means real. Sarah nodded and began to write. The Walsh house stands quiet now, its rooms empty of recordings but full of echoes. Not the old echoes of preserved laughter, but the kind that remind us that every story has many chapters. The sad ones make the happy ones sweeter. The broken pieces make the healing possible. And sometimes the most beautiful sounds are the ones we don't try to capture at all. Outside, Michael's voice drifted up again, reading a new story to his siblings. Tommy interrupted with questions. Katie added her own plot suggestions, and none of it was perfect. It was better than that. It was true. Sarah closed her notebook and joined them under the maple tree, leaving her window open to catch the autumn breeze. Somewhere in the distance, children were laughing, real children, making new memories that would not be recorded or scheduled or preserved. And that was exactly as it should be.